Alright gang, got a Canadian on the bench. This is a Mark Beneteau guitar from 1991. Mark is great. He's I've seen a number of his guitars over the years, fixed a couple of them, and he works over in St. Thomas in Ontario, so he's relatively local. And always very impressed with his work. He's got great sensibility. His design is very, very classic, very restrained. He doesn't load it up with a bunch of superfluous stuff. He doesn't put on a bunch of pearl or anything. But you can tell that they are very... He's keyed into what makes a guitar work. And the other thing I really like is every guitar of his I've seen has always got a lot of play wear on it. And they're made to be played. And they're not collector's eye candy. So it's good. Very honest guitar maker. He's been building since the 70s. I don't think he was part of that John Larrivee crew. The one with Grit Laskin and Linda Manzer and David Wren, those guys. I don't think he was part of that, but he's obviously been inspired. Because if you're building guitars in the 70s in Canada, you have John Larrivee as sort of a seminal figure. That rosette is kind of Larrivesque, Spanish-style marquetry rosette. Nice Sitka top, back and sides. This is a big guitar. It's sort of like a, well, I guess it's full dreadnought size. Quite wide in the body. D35 type 3-piece back. And it's in here for a couple of issues. First thing is that the bridge is lifting slightly at the back edge here. It's not extreme. Glued on all the way. I might not even have to take this one off all the way. You've seen me do that a number of times before, but this one is on there good and solid, and it's not warped very much, so I can probably just clean out the old glue in the loose portion and glue it right back down again. And we're going to go for a new nut on this as well. Interesting headstock. That's nice. After working on so many Nationals lately, it's great to have a steel string headstock that you can, get your fingers in to put the strings in. Headstock shape is actually very much like Grit Laskin, actually. This little cutout here. And I just noticed this. There's an interesting repair. See if I can get you in closer. One of the issues with having those wide slots is that there's not very much support for the string posts here. I don't know what kind of tuners these are, and they might be Godos. Obviously, this one up here at the top was coming inwards a bit, tipping, and a little piece of wood has been made to act like a cradle for it. That's a great idea. I'm going to steal that idea one of these days. It's held in place with a tiny little screw. Just imagine the kind of right angle screwdriver you have to get that in there. Pretty cool. So, like I was saying, we're going to do a new nut. I don't know if this one's original. I kind of think not. Just some things about it seem like it doesn't fit perfectly. It's not bone, obviously a plastic material of some kind, I think. And there's something just a little bit odd with the string spacing. The distance between the E and B strings is actually wider than the B and G. Significantly wider. So I think we're going to make a new one. I've been asked to make one that has more equal spacing. Just going to clean off some of the grunge here. Other things I've noticed, Mark Beneteau uses a very thin finish. I think it's lacquer, and it seems to check very early on, and it also gets very, very yellow very quickly. But on the soundboard, it's so thin that it wears through very fast, it's great. I think for the sound of the instruments, they always sound very free, very open. So, getting rid of some of the stuff. The saddle here is very, very low. Actually, the bridge itself is quite low too. I don't know if it's been cut down or not. So, depends on how this thing ends up. After we've got it glued back down, we might suggest that it could be time for a neck reset. Doesn't need a huge one. The good thing about these is I recall he doesn't actually glue his dovetails in. He just uses a screw. So you can take the neck off. You take off the fingerboard extension and the dovetail just comes right off after you've loosened the screw. So doing a neck reset isn't as arduous as having to steam off a Martin neck. So I think it might benefit from a little bit more saddle height. Well, this is just a piece of an old coffee can lid that I cut, and It's quite a snug saddle, especially when you got a really low saddle and there's not very much material to grab onto. Use my little flush cutting front pulling pliers here. Just protects the top of the bridge. Okay. Nice. Another thing I always do when I take a bridge out, first thing is I grab a pencil and just mark the front end. Sometimes it's hard to tell, and I want them to go back in the same way that they came out. Just using a feeler gauge here to see how far the looseness extends. Yeah, it's really not bad. Just sort of the bulge here goes, yeah, down here. Doesn't go as far as the string holes. Loosens up a little bit for the G and B strings. And yeah, so not bad. What I'm going to do is use the side of the feeler gauge here to scrape some of the glue off the underside of the bridge. It's getting harder and harder to find good drafting tape. So I'm using, this is regular painter's tape. I'm sticking it to my shirt first though, so that it loses its aggressive tackiness, and I'm just using a little bit. Not pushing down very hard, just enough to hold that sheet in place. And you can imagine what happens next. Using the sandpaper against the soundboard area. Put a little bit of downward pressure on the bridge. And we'll try to clean up some of the glue that's on the surface of the soundboard. Now before I go clamping anything, I want to make sure that the inside isn't going to give me any surprises. See, we've got a nice big flat bridge plate there, lots of space for clamping, and this piezoelectric line here that's coming through the saddle slot. That's kind of interesting. It looks like it was originally sort of stuck down there with a sandwich between two pads, and it's come loose over time. We might stick that down again. But yeah, no, that seems okay. Everything else inside looks good. No real surprises, just a big X-brace design with sensible support everywhere. Nicely done, good craftsmanship. Now there are a couple lines behind the bridge here that I think they're in the lacquer. There's one that runs here, one that runs sort of here. And it's odd, I can't tell if they're actual cracks in the spruce or if they're just in the lacquer. It's kind of concerning, so before I do anything else, I'm actually going to put a light inside, turn off all the other lights, and see if I can see light through those. Okay, just going to push up on the soundboard a little bit. And I don't see anything. I think those don't go through. Those are just lacquer checks, so we're in business. Okay, just doing a test run here before I put the glue in. I've got 4 clamps, corresponding cork-backed cauls on the inside too, so that I don't mar the bridge plate. And things are good and tight all the way along the end of the joint there. So I think we're ready. Okay, so with the pressure off the center clamps, the gap opens wide enough that I can get my little 6/1000 feeler gauge in there again. And I'm going to use fish glue for this. I like it for this kind of thing because it doesn't creep very well. It's very brittle glue. It doesn't turn rubbery. And get quite a lake of it in there, more than I need. If you think this is ridiculous to be doing this, yeah, you're right. Tricks. Use the largest size nail set that you can get. Light taps. And be aware that sometimes one part of a nut will be thicker than other parts. So you can try to discern that, because if you have a narrow slot on this side and a wider end on this part, and you start driving it like a wedge, things are going to explode. So usually it's best to try to get, a little bit of a lip started, then you can work from the other end and maybe push it out this way. Again, if someone got glue on this side of that nut, we're in, a bit of trouble. We want to be going back again with the scalpel blade, cleaning out any glue, and if we manage to enlarge it by 10 thousandths of an inch, that's fine. Who cares? We can make a nut that will be 10 thousandths wider. To that side, yeah, still feels dangerous. Okay, there we go. Feels tight on the other side. Again, don't rush it. Rock it out. There we go. So yeah, we had some glue on the bottom of the slot. We had glue on the back of the slot and along the front edge of the fingerboard. Just using some small chisels to clean up the bottom of the slot. I also use a small flat bottom file. I want to get rid of any excess glue. It's also on the front edge of the fingerboard as well, because that's the surface we're eventually going to glue to. And I'll also take a little square here. Just make sure the slot is flat bottomed. You don't want to hump, because if it rocks in the center, it'll be very, very difficult to get the nut to sit right, and it's never going to be a clean looking installation. And actually, I just noticed that binding there is starting to come away from the edge of the fingerboard. And on this guitar, that's kind of dangerous, because there are little cracks that run from the ends of the frets through the binding all the way down to the neck. Sometimes, it's important to fit we cut back the fret ends, obviously, the tang underneath, so that it'll accommodate the binding. If you are too clean with that and actually make it exactly the right length, over time as the board shrinks, sometimes the glue is stronger than the binding itself, and it'll actually hold, and the fret end will cut or crack it, which is what's happening here. So this entire chunk is in danger of falling off if we hit it the wrong way. So I'm going to get some super glue in there, the thin stuff, and hold that down in place before we go any farther. Just going to put a little paste wax on the surface around the binding here. Now, the glue will actually scrape off pretty cleanly, but let's be neat if we can. It's just some water-thin super glue. And I don't really want to put tape on this. I'm just going to hold it in place for a minute while it dries. I always start by flattening the surface that's going to contact the front edge of the fingerboard. And I swap it end for end frequently to try to keep it coming down even. This is actually usually held in my bench vise, but the vise is currently occupied by my camera stick, so we'll do it this way. I work my way up to 220 grit, and I check while I go just to make sure that it's staying flat. and that's pretty good. The other thing I'll do is figure out which side I want to face downwards. Sometimes there'll be little imperfections in the bone. That's the side I want down. What I'm going to do is actually mark the surface that will go against the fingerboard. I just take a knife, a little hatch mark there, and a little bit of black ink, and it's scrimshaw. So now I know that this is the surface that's going to go against the fingerboard. Take a flat block with a good hard right angle, lay that on top of my sanding block, and then I can position the marked surface up against it. So I've got a nice right angle to work to, and I'll work up through the grits to make sure the bottom is nice and flat and perpendicular to the front surface. We know the old nut fit very well in the slot, so I can use it as a reference. Taking some measurements here, we see that it's about, well, it's between 188 thousandths and about 185, so it's pretty consistent. And so we'll make our new nut about 188 thousandths. Now, you can do this on the same sanding block, although this nut blank starting off is probably 250 thousandths. Well, it's about 240. So there's a significant amount of material to come off. I'm going to do that on a disc sander out in my shed. So I'm not going to stand here all day and try to abrade it by hand. On this guitar, the shape of the headstock curves down, and actually this curve resolves at the front edge of the nut rather than at the back. So the nut's actually going to be tapered slightly wider at the back than at the front, and I want to mirror that. So what I normally do is push the nut over to the player's side of the guitar. It's going to be flush on the back edge here, and I can take a mechanical pencil, because it's got a nice thin lead, and I'll just lightly trace that. I can do both sides. And on this one I can also do the back edge. This is a standard pencil, an HP pencil that I've planed down flat, and it bisects the lead. I rest that on top of the frets. And this will transfer the curve of the fingerboard, the radius, onto the nut. And it also gives me a line to work to. This is a little razor saw. This is just a cheapo X-Acto saw. It works pretty good for bone. Okay, so we've got a nut that looks like it fits. Next thing I'm going to do is measure distances for the outside strings. Front edge of the nut here. I'm going to go in just about 3 millimeters from either side, or just about 1/8 of an inch. That gives me my distance for the outside strings. Okay, with the outsides marked, we can figure out the others. This is a Stuart Mcdonald string spacing rule, and it's got a bunch of hash marks on it. You slide that along until you get 6 units that are the correct distance apart. Mark your lines, away you go. Very fast, very accurate, good tool. There's something about it though. It's designed under the idea that there should be proportional string spacing on the outside, from the outside of each string, so that on the heavier wound strings you get more space than on the treble strings. And that's cool. Most players won't really notice. I started to think about it though, and I realized that when you're playing a string, you're not pressing down on the side of the string or playing the space between them. You're bringing your finger down on the top of a radius. So there's a very small point of contact theoretically. I think in some ways it makes more sense to make them equally spaced because of that. And for the longest times that's how it was done. Most factory guitars had it that way. So that's what I've been doing recently. I've gone back to just measuring, using millimeters because they're convenient. And in this case we end up with 40.5 millimeters. I divide that by 5 to get the string spacing, divisions. That's 8.1 millimeters. And because I happen to have a caliper that reads in decimal inches, I can go to my phone, plug that in, and I find out that 8.1 millimeters equals 318 thousandths of an inch. So that's what I'll use to mark out the strings. Next thing I do is I grab my scalpel and a little square here, and I'm going to mark those lines across the width of the nut. The way I do that is I put the scalpel right on the center of the pencil line, and I can move the square right up into contact so I know that I'm in the right place. And then first couple passes are very light because the bone's very hard. And this is my little X-Acto razor saw, and it cuts about a 10,000ths curve. And that will ride right in that scalpel line. So give it a few passes, going deeper on the back side of the nut because most of that material is going to get cut away. Just getting rid of some of the extra material off the back side of the nut. Doesn't need to be there. It's just going to be bogging down our fret file. So I like to do as much of the work off the guitar as possible. For one thing, it's easier to see, and the other thing, there's no chance you're going to bump into the finish. Remember that pencil line I had along the front edge? That's what I'm working down to. I'll go to the top of that pencil line, and I know that when I go onto the guitar, I still have a little bit of material to refine the fit. I'm not going to go too low. The other thing I usually do is work my way up through the files almost as if they were like working with sandpaper. So on the larger strings, I will start off with, say, the 20 thousandths, then the 36, then I don't know, it just seems to be better than scrubbing away with the big file all the way down. Okay, with strings on, we can figure out where we are here. Now if I fret this guitar at the 3rd fret and press down, you can see there's quite a bit of slop in between the bottom of the string and the top of the 1st fret. There's a space there. There should be a space there, but we want it to be very, very minimal. So minimal, in fact, that the usual way of checking that is actually sighting against a bright background or a light source just to see. You want to see a hair's width. You could try to measure it, but with a feeler gauge, it's functionally impossible because it's like 3 or 4 thousandths, and by the time you get to the middle strings there, it's just, you don't do it. So usually, you just feel it, and once you know what it feels like, you know what it feels like. You could, of course, measure without fretting the guitar, and that measurement between the bottom of the string and top of the fret is going to be around 21 thousandths-ish. If you've got a really heavy-handed player who strums hard, maybe you go a little bit higher. If you've got a really delicate touch and someone who's very sensitive to pitch, maybe you go a little bit lower. The main thing is that there's quite a lot of tension in this string when you're fretting in these lower positions and you're stretching it. If you have to stretch it to reach down to the fret, then you're going to be pulling that string sharp and it's not going to sound in tune. So the closer we can get that to the fret, the more accurate the tuning is going to be and easier to play. So the way I do it, I just, I file a little bit, check, file, and check. There's a jig that you can buy that's very expensive that stacks up feeler gauges, and that'll get you in the range as well. Again, still, at the end of the day, you're just sort of working by feel. You want to customize it for every instrument. The other thing is, because you're going to be tuning and detuning the strings and taking them off, I put on a cheap set of strings. You don't do these with the $22 set of special coated strings. Because, that's a lot of wear and tear. So they always go out with a fresh set. Okay, so I've got it set up the way I like it. You can actually hear it. Maybe. There's a characteristic little pinky sound. The strings are just off the top of the fret. They're almost laying on it, but not quite. One thing I did notice, the action is okay. It's 6/64 to 5/64. I wouldn't want it too much higher. Of course, we have that very low saddle to contend with. The E string, the high E, the break angle is very marginal. I think what I can do, I'm going to just extend the string slot that runs between the bridge pin hole just a little bit so that we can lower the string a little bit more and just give it a touch more break angle in case they don't want to go for the neck reset just now. Maybe they play another year or two. Lots of ways to do this. If I have to do a full set of pins, I'll actually use a Dremel tool with a tiny little carbide burr. So that worked well. The high E string's now sounding much purer, clearer tone. So we're going to do the final shaping and polishing. We're going to round over the corners slightly. We're going to take it to basically a quarter round shape on the back edge of the nut. And you can see that we've actually buried these strings to their full depth. That's not great. We want the bass strings to be about halfway. So half of the string is going to be exposed and in the slot. So if you have too much, if they get too low, you end up with weird rattles and stuff, and it's just not right. I think it looks better if you got about half of them in the slot. The B and the E strings I leave at about full depth. Some people are so aggressive that they can actually pull them out of their slot if they're doing hammer-ons in first position and stuff. So full depth for these guys and about halfway for the rest of them. With the nut on its side here on my little shooting board, I can actually see the shape of the nut slots, and it makes it very easy to follow along with a sanding block and cut those down to the depth I want them. Sort of helps preserve the radius. Now I'm perfecting the contour a little bit more. I want it gently rounded. Everyone has their own style. Okay, before I go on to using micro mesh and really polishing this, I'm doing a little bit of a subtlety here. Think about how the strings go through the nut and they come off at an angle to meet the string posts. And you sometimes hear little pinging noises and stuff where the string windings are binding on the corners of the back end of the nut. I take a rat tail file, so it's a little round file that varies to a point, and I just relieve that back corner just a little bit. And this softens the transition into the nut. I think it makes tuning more stable. Just a little thing, just a little tiny subtlety. Now I'm using some micro mesh abrasive, and we'll really make it shine. 1800, 24, 36, 4000, 6000. And to be honest, this isn't necessary. Like, this is all kind of cosmetic stuff. It's amazing how awful a nut can look and still do its job well. But, you know, if you're going to make a custom nut, you might as well make it look nice. Okay, we're just going to glue this in place. Now, super glue works fine, and I'll use it if I'm in a pinch or I'm pressed for time. Otherwise, tight bond, fish glue, they work just as well. So just putting a little bit, not a whole lot, on the front surface that goes up against the end grain of the fingerboard. You can knock on the end grain of the fingerboard with no problem, and it doesn't get damaged. So it's a good tight fit in the slot too, so don't have to worry too much. And I'll string this up with just maybe the outside ease or something, just to keep it in place and make sure that the alignment is the way I like it. Well, all right. Looks pretty good. Works good too. I put a little bit of pencil lead in the bottom of the slots. It's all the lubrication it needs. So it's all set up, ready to go. Like I mentioned before, the action is on the high side of normal. I think it's probably playable for most people. I'd like to see it down a little bit more. Can't take that saddle down any farther, so this is the best it can be as it is. Maybe we'll see it again someday for a neck reset. That'd be cool. I'd like to see what his neck joint looks like. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I will see you again soon.